we've invited a guest speaker from the University of Iowa, Dr. Jessica Welburn. Alexander Clark was a local person who lived in Muscatine in the mid-1800s, and he is famous for several things, but a couple things you've probably heard of already is that he fought for his daughter's rights to attend the grammar school in Muscatine in 1867. She was initially denied admission because of her race. And he took that case to the Supreme Court of Iowa, which ruled in her favor. So Susan, Alexander Clark's daughter, was the first black student to graduate from Muscatine High School in 1871. She was followed by her brother, Alexander Jr., who also graduated from Muscatine High School in 1873. And the father, Alexander Clark Sr., made this possible. The other thing that he's famous for is that in 1879, that son, Alexander Jr., I just mentioned, was the first black student to graduate from the University of Iowa Law School. He was followed shortly thereafter in 1884 by his father, Alexander Clark, who is now, I think, in his 50s, who graduated also from law school. So the father and son are both University of Iowa Law School graduates who practiced in both Iowa and Illinois. And so we celebrate his connection to Muscatine. His home is still existing on 3rd Street. And we celebrate that today with a lecture by Dr. Jessica Welburn, who is an assistant professor of sociology and African American studies at the University of Iowa. I just learned that she did her postdoctorate work at the University of Michigan, a place that I'm familiar with also. And her talk is entitled Racial Inequality in the Post-Obama Era. Jessica is a native of Iowa, and so this is somewhat of a return to her. Her research interests include race and ethnicity, social mobility, urban inequality, cultural sociology, and qualitative research methods. Jessica's work has focused on the experiences of African Americans in the post-civil rights era, including how they conceptualize their social mobility prospects and their strategies for navigating persistent racism and discrimination. She is an author, and a couple of books I understand are coming out soon, and so I ask you to welcome Dr. Jessica Welburn to our campus.
All right, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here tonight and talk a little bit about race relations, racial inequality in the post-Obama era. So I decided to talk about racial inequality in the post-Obama era this evening because for many, the election of an African-American president is if not the watershed moment in American civil rights history, right? On election night in 2008, Obama said, quote, "If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time, who still questions the power of our democracy, tonight is your answer." It's the answer told by lines that stretched around schools and churches in numbers this nation has never seen, by people who waited 3 hours and 4 hours, many for the first time in their lives, because they believed that this time must be different, that their voices could be that difference. It's the answer spoken by young and old, rich and poor, Democrat and Republican, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, gay, straight, disabled, and not disabled. Americans who sent a message to the world that we have never just been a collection of individuals or a collection of red states and blue states. We are, and always will be, the United States of America. Such a moment may have seemed unimaginable for many civil rights pioneers like Alexander Clark when he sued the Muscatine School District in 1867. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, had only been passed for a couple of years. It wouldn't be until almost a century later that the US would formally outlaw racial segregation and discrimination. As we come together to celebrate his legacy, it's important to think critically about how much progress we have made. The US is undoubtedly a different place than it was in 1867, and the mid-20th century civil rights movement helped to solidify many changes that Clark and scores of civil rights advocates have fought for generations. as we see more African Americans earning high school and college degrees, moving into better occupations, and holding offices at all levels of government, progress is undeniable. In fact, sociologist Orlando Patterson points out in his book, The Ordeal of Integration, that African Americans have really made remarkable progress considering we're just a few generations out of slavery. So the election of Barack Obama was a turning point because for some, it offered a hope of a post-racial era, one where race would no longer be the primary factor that determined outcomes in the US. However, evidence is overwhelming that we are nowhere near a post-racial era. In fact, for me, despite the election of our first Black president being a watershed moment in American history, this is not the time to pat ourselves on the back. For African Americans, this post-Obama era is one of progress coupled with continued obstacles. Persistent racism and discrimination impacts opportunities for educational attainment, occupational attainment, income, housing, health outcomes, and many other areas of life in the US. Thus, racism and discrimination persist, and severe racial disparities have yet to be ameliorated. Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva points to the rise of colorblind racism in the civil rights era. He argues that for many, particularly for white Americans, civil rights legislation means that opportunities have been equalized for all Americans. As a result, according to him, according to his theory, racial disparities are the fault of racial minorities because we've had all of this legislation that has supposedly equalized opportunities. The consequence of this type of racism, which is pervasive, is that we've entered into a time of the gradual retrenchment of civil rights era policies before our country isn't ready. This includes the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act a couple of years ago, constant attacks on affirmative action policy, attacks on anything related to diversity or integration, or any other initiative targeted at equalizing opportunities for racial minorities. So we have to ask ourselves at this moment how far we've come in achieving racial equality and whether or not we are moving in the right direction. Tonight, I'm going to talk about a few of these persistent inequalities in detail: experiences that African Americans have with racism and discrimination, access to education, occupational and economic attainment, and health. In addition, I'll talk about experiences with police brutality in the criminal justice system. Because my research is on African Americans, I'm going to focus primarily on the Black American experience, but I want to emphasize that inequalities are facing racial minorities from different backgrounds in the US, and we must not forget that systems of oppression are indeed linked. So I will start off by talking a little bit about experiences with racism and discrimination, and specifically some of the research that I have done on African Americans' experiences with racism and discrimination. I have a book that's forthcoming on Princeton University Press with several colleagues: Michelle Lamont, Nazim Mizrahi, Graziella Silva, Josh Gutskow, Elisa Reyes, and Hannah Herzog. And our book compares how African Americans, Black Brazilians, Ethiopian Jews, Mizrahi Jews, and Arab Israelis think about and combat racism and discrimination. It's a great comparative book that will be out this summer. I'm going to focus a bit just on the findings from the US case for a second. So we interviewed 150 working class and middle class African American men and women living in New Jersey. And our findings show that for African Americans, racism and discrimination are everyday occurrences. They report frequent experiences with being disrespected, misunderstood, underestimated, and being blocked from opportunities. So for example, one of our respondents describes being uncomfortable with his coworkers. When asked if there are times when he felt misunderstood because of his race, he says, "All the time. I can't even say anything in a meeting without being misunderstood. Every time I say something, it's misunderstood. They don't share your philosophies. They don't understand my taste. They just don't understand anything about me. They look at me like I got two heads or something. You know, where you try to make a point. It's really valid, but they just don't seem to get it. And I'm constantly getting many Black issues or many Black comments like, hey, you look pretty good. I'm dressed like a Black guy tonight, aren't I? Any racial biases get tested or directed to you when you're the only one in the workplace." Another respondent describes an experience he had that stood out to him while he was working at Saks Fifth Avenue in New York City. He said, "My wife comes in a $2,000 Armani suit. That's what I sell. She has an orange leather coat, an orange Gucci bag. She comes, speaks to me, goes downstairs and shops, and as she's shopping, a security guard is hiding and following her around the store. I go downstairs to meet her and I see two security guards, and I say, 'Hey guys, what's going on? That's my wife. Why are you following her around the store?' That same day, a white gentleman came into the store with a suit on, a trench coat, laid 25 Armani ties and $150 a piece across his arm, looked at them one time, cuffed his arm to hide the ties, and walked right out of the store with the ties. And they didn't even see him. But you're following my wife around the store while this guy's stealing ties upstairs. And you don't see him because he doesn't fit the description of who you think a criminal is. As a result of these experiences, all of our 150 respondents report experiences with racism and discrimination that range. And as a result, we find that because of this the constant nature of racism and discrimination in the US, our respondents have to have a repertoire of strategies ready to go for navigating persistent experiences with racism and discrimination. The strategies include weighing what's at stake in particular situations, walking away to preserve energy or personal safety, filing a formal complaint or writing a letter when opportunities are being blocked, or confronting the discriminator. So, for example, in describing her response to a coworker's jealousy of her being able to work from home because she just had a baby, one of our respondents, who's an insurance adjuster, says, "My response is usually to go somewhere and calm down, because my first instinct is to curse somebody out. But I have to go breathe and take it easy, bring it back, calm down. And then I usually don't go to them directly. I usually talk it out with somebody else first and say, look, hear me out. What do you think? Am I wrong? And then when they say no, then it's like, okay, let me bring you and tell you how I feel, and then I take it that way." So this respondent is talking about, really trying to think through what happens, because we find that a lot of people don't immediately want to believe that they have been the victim of racism or discrimination. So they really have to think through how they're going to deal with it and how they're going to combat it. Another respondent, who's a teacher, explains that he suffered discrimination at work, where he, quote, became marginalized. In response to being advised to being a team player and to be less confrontational, he tried to conform to the expectations that he felt his coworkers had of him. He said, "Honestly, I'm bojangling and tap dancing. I'm doing a lot more smiling. You want to be liked so that you'll debunk the stereotype that people inevitably have of you being hostile, because you find yourself not having the economic roots to sort of just be in a position to say, you know what, I don't need this, and I can be free to say what I want. So you bojangle it out of there and you say, okay, well, I'll keep that in mind." So he has to really do essentially an elaborate dance to get along with his coworkers and not lose his job because he needs the money. At other times when necessary, our respondents will file formal complaints, write letters, or directly confront the discriminators when they have had an unfair experience. So in one example, the son of a law administrator was suspended from his predominantly white private school because, together with other black athletes at the school, he had attacked a white student who had started a fight with them. So the others who were involved were all suspended, and they were charged with assault. The son's record was cleared because the respondent, who was a law administrator, had contact with a prominent law firm in northern New Jersey that wrote a letter to the school, a legal letter, suggesting that these charges be dropped immediately or the school would face some legal action. So the respondent said, "It was unfair treatment that the other teens were not absolved of. I get a letter saying he's reinstated, there's no absenteeism on his records, blah, blah, blah. It was the result of the fact that the principal got a letter from a prominent law firm saying, your ass is going to get sued. Nothing else. You can see how this still bothers me. My son and I get ostracized because I had this case taken care of. Other black kids that were involved got school suspensions, got some penalties at prom, suspensions from teams, and had to make other appearances in court. This is the way of the world." The constancy of systemic racism and discrimination, as this respondent starts to get at, has serious consequences for African Americans' daily quality of life and also their outcomes and opportunities. Both covert and overt experiences with racism and discrimination indeed serve to preserve America's racial hierarchy, and it's evident in all dimensions of life. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the consequences of the American racial hierarchy, persistent racism and discrimination, the way it preserves the racial hierarchy, by talking a little bit about education, housing, occupational and economic attainment, issues of inequality in health, And I will finish up by talking a little bit also about incarceration and police brutality. So I'm starting off talking a little bit about schooling and educational attainment. In 2014, the National Education Association explored the legacy of Brown versus Board of Education 60 years after the landmark decision. And this is perhaps pretty interesting for us to talk about tonight, given the work that Alexander Clark did in Muscatine. The report points to areas of improvement and to severe disparities in educational attainment that have yet to be ameliorated. So on the one hand, we've seen gains in educational attainment for racial minorities. For example, the Pew Charitable Trust Foundation finds that in 1960, there was a 24% gap in high school degree attainment rates between blacks and whites. By 2012, this had narrowed to just a 7% gap, so some significant gains there. We've also seen rates of college degree attainment increase for all groups. And this is significant because it means that we've seen more African Americans and members of other minority groups move into better jobs and into the middle class. On the other hand, while the Supreme Court ruled school segregation unconstitutional nationwide, there is some evidence that schools are nearly as segregated as they were in 1954. So the National Education Association has found that between 2009 and 2010, or during the 2009-2010 school year, 74% of African Americans and 80% of Latinos attended schools that were majority minority schools. These schools are also often segregated by income, so that means that disadvantage becomes heavily concentrated in majority minority schools. In fact, the NEA finds that in New York City during the 2009-2010 school year, the average white student attended a school that was 30% low income. In contrast, the average black and Latino students attended schools that were 70% low income. Students in high poverty schools are less likely to graduate on time and fare worse on standardized tests, including the SAT. In addition, data point to other significant disparities. For example, we see that black and Latino students are particularly more likely to be disciplined and more likely to be tracked into special education courses, and less likely to be able to take advanced placement courses and other college preparation courses. This issue has received a lot of attention locally in Iowa City because there has been a recent report on the Iowa City Community School District, which shows that black students are being disciplined more than white students at a significantly higher rate. They are also faring worse on standardized tests and other measures of academic attainment. So it's particularly close to home because I'm a graduate of Iowa City West High, and as I was reading through this report and attending a school board meeting recently, I was thinking about my childhood memories of school in Iowa and thinking about how often I was dismissed and disregarded by my teachers. I attribute much of my own success, my ability to go on to college and graduate school, to having college-educated parents. To be quite honestly, I can count on one hand the times that teachers talked with me about my college plans, suggest that I applied to the colleges that I did, or encouraged me to think about my career possibilities. So when we think about where we are when it comes to educational attainment, while we have certainly made progress on some dimensions, it would be hard to argue that African Americans have not seen improvements since the Civil Rights Movement. As we think about having our first African American president, we still see high levels of segregation and obstacles to educational attainment that whites simply don't face in this country. Now I'm going to move on to talking a little bit about neighborhoods, which is very much connected to schooling. Racial minorities, particularly African Americans and also Latinos, find themselves in neighborhoods that are more segregated and have fewer resources, such as good schools, job opportunities, and public resources. For example, some researchers at Brown University have shown that we have only seen slight declines in racial residential segregation over the past few decades. I have a chart. So this is not a slide-heavy presentation, in case you didn't guess that already, but I do have a few graphics that I will show. So this is from some researchers at Brown University, and it shows residential segregation data for whites, African Americans, and Latinos. And basically what we can see here, may be difficult for some people to see, but we basically see that so they have data from 1980 to 2009, and we can see that the typical neighborhood for whites in 1980 was about 89% white. So that meant the average white person lived in a neighborhood that was 89% white, people like them. This has declined slightly. By 2009, 75% of whites lived in a neighborhood that was predominantly white, in a neighborhood that was with people that were mostly like them. Circumstances are quite different for African Americans and also Latinos. They are more likely to live in majority-minority neighborhoods. So, and this has remained fairly consistent. African Americans are more likely to live in neighborhoods where there are a lot of blacks and Latinos and fewer whites. And Latinos actually are gradually, as their numbers increase, becoming likely to live in neighborhoods that are increasingly minority. So we see some declines in racial residential segregation, but we see that people are still quite segregated by race in terms of the areas and the types of neighborhoods that they live in. So this is coupled with research that shows that neighborhoods are actually becoming increasingly segregated by income. Between 1980 and 2010, the Pew Research Center shows that the number of low-income families living in predominantly low-income census tracts increased. We've also seen the number of upper-income households living in predominantly upper-income neighborhoods, in neighborhoods that are predominantly upper-income also increase. So when we take that together, it means that we see a lot of African Americans and also Latinos in particular are concentrated in neighborhoods that aren't just racially segregated, but that also have fewer economic resources. So sociologist Mary Patillo has shown that even for middle-class African Americans, there is an increased likelihood of living in neighborhoods that are racially segregated and that have higher levels of economic disadvantage. This means that even as you climb the socioeconomic ladder in the US, as a person of color, particularly African Americans, you are not necessarily shielded from racial residential segregation. Some of our most segregated cities in the country include Milwaukee, Detroit, Boston, and Philadelphia. In fact, some of our most diverse cities often see higher levels of segregation as numbers of racial minorities increase. African Americans during the Great Migration and later numbers of Latinos, we see people segregating and blocking racial minorities out of certain neighborhoods. We see this, for example, increasingly in areas in Iowa. In Iowa City, this is an issue of great concern for city leaders and community activists and residents as the city becomes more diverse. For those who are interested, actually next Friday, April 1st, working group I'm a part of will be having a little mini conference at the University of Iowa on housing access and affordability in Iowa City. The conference is called Are You a Good Neighbor? So if you're interested, it's going to be next Friday, and I believe we're going to be starting at 10 a.m. Can give you more information afterwards. But the fact that we're having this is evidence, right, that this is a huge area of concern increasingly for people locally. So explanations for racial residential segregation vary, but there's clear evidence that whites remain hesitant to live in neighborhoods that are heavily populated by blacks and Latinos. In addition, housing discrimination often prevents blacks and also Latinos from gaining access to certain neighborhoods through a variety of methods, including racial steering, refusing to show homes to people in certain areas, and also discriminatory rental and lending practices. I think I have one more chart on residential segregation. So basically, this is some data that shows how attractive it is for whites to live in neighborhoods that have a black family. And they're showing, this chart shows their preferences, and I took this from the University of Michigan, so I'm sorry it doesn't have a label. I don't know why it got separated from the graphic. But so basically, this is whites' preferences for living in neighborhoods with other people of color, and the data is from 1976 to 2004. And so, if you look at the diagram in the top left, you can see that's a neighborhood with one black family, essentially, one black house. So they're giving these little charts to look at and say, how do you feel about living in this neighborhood if this is where the minority family lives? And the white family is, the white respondents living where the star is. And so most white people are okay with that. They were mostly okay with it in 76, and they've become increasingly okay with it by 2004. You know, that overwhelming majority of people were fine with it. But you can see from the chart that as more dots become colored, so to speak, whites become increasingly less comfortable living in that type of neighborhood, and that's still the case in 2004. So when we think about causes of racial residential segregation, again, there's clear evidence that that a good number of whites don't want to live around blacks, and similar data has been shown for Latinos. They're not as concerned about living around Asians. And so this preserves racially segregated neighborhoods, fuels discriminatory lending, fuels racial steering housing. And this is important. Racial residential segregation is important because it determines access to a variety of resources. I just talked about educational attainment. Types of schools people go to are really important. Also, types of jobs that are available. If you're in a neighborhood that's more segregated and often has fewer resources, that means you may have fewer job opportunities. Also, quality of life issues. Fewer resources mean perhaps more kind of social disarray and those types of issues. So neighborhood is another significant area. Racial residential segregation is another area where we have a long way to go. Okay. And some of these slides are intentionally blank so that we can kind of move together and talk until my next graph. So it's meant to be blank. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about employment, income, and wealth. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, while we see considerable economic progress for racial minorities in the post-civil rights era, or we do see considerable economic progress, and this is undeniable. In his famous book, The Declining Significance of Race, William Julius Wilson, who's a sociologist, argues that civil rights legislation provided the opportunity for many African Americans to seek out white-collar jobs and to move into the middle class. We've also seen overall poverty rates drop for African Americans since the mid-20th century. For example, the Pew Research Center reports that in 1963, the poverty rate for African Americans was an astonishing 42%, and by 2013 it dropped to 28%, still quite high, which I'll get into in a second, but we do see declines, and there are other indicators of progress again, rise in overall incomes, people working in better jobs, more people who are college educated, but we still see continued disparities in employment, income, and wealth that are causes for concern. So, as William Julius Wilson argues in The Declining Significance of Race, deindustrialization has had a negative impact on job prospects for many African Americans, particularly less skilled African Americans, as we've seen well-paying manufacturing jobs disappear and more jobs move outside of urban areas. We see a lot of African Americans, particularly those who are less educated, shut out of the American labor market. We also see persistent labor market discrimination. For example, we see in a newly released study that's gotten a lot of media attention by Sonia Kang, who's at the University of Toronto, and her colleagues at Stanford. And the study shows that minorities who whiten their resumes by changing their names and or removing references to activities and past employment experiences that signal their minority status, say, membership in a black professional organization or something like that. People who remove these things from their resume have a better chance of getting callbacks for interviews. So this was even the case for job ads that explicitly mention diversity. And so we've seen a lot of evidence lately of rampant employer discrimination. Diva Pager, who's a sociologist at Harvard University, has a lot of research on this as well that shows that just across the board, employers discriminate either in terms of who gets interviews, who gets interviewed for certain types of jobs, and how people are treated once they get to the job interview. So the consequences of this are severe for African Americans. So African Americans are significantly more likely to be unemployed than whites. And I do have a chart for this, I think. So these are unemployment rates by race, and I took this from the Washington Post. And we see, so this is from 2000 to 2015, and obviously we see huge peaks for everybody. Unemployment rates in 2008 when we had the recession. But so blacks are the blue line, Hispanics are the, whatever it is for you in the audience, green, gray, and then whites are the red line. And so we can see that across the board, blacks always have higher rates of unemployment. They were disastrously high in 2008, and they've declined, but not at the same rate that they've declined for whites. We see also Latinos facing high unemployment, although it's not as high as it is for African Americans. So as of right now, unemployment rates overall for whites have fallen below 5%, and obviously they're more than twice as high for African Americans and significantly higher for Latinos. So that's one consequence of the changing economy and also persistent employer discrimination and limited job opportunities is just high unemployment rates. We also see that African Americans who are employed hold often lower status jobs than whites, even if they have the same level of education. So for example, economists Derek Hamilton, Algernon Austin, and William Darity show that African American men are more likely to be overrepresented in low-paying jobs like service jobs, cashier, or other jobs like that, and underrepresented in higher-paying managerial positions. So that translates into different economic outcomes, obviously, for whites and blacks. So talking about differential economic outcomes, I said a few minutes ago that we've seen a decline in poverty rates, right, for African Americans. But we've seen, obviously, that they remain significantly higher than they are for whites. The overall income gap remains large, and Pew Foundation actually suggests that the actual income gap between blacks and whites hasn't really narrowed significantly since 1960. So we've seen incomes go up for blacks and we've seen them go up for whites. We haven't seen much narrowing in the actual level of the gap. We also see considerable wealth gaps between blacks and whites, and also between Latinos, that paint a perhaps more depressing picture of economic attainment for African Americans. While earnings have increased, when we look at the wealth gap, it really has not gotten smaller at all over the past several decades, and so we see the wealth gap often being tens of thousands of dollars between the average white family and the average black family. There are a number of factors that contribute to this, so disparities in earnings can contribute, but also limited savings and investments, limited intergenerational transfers of wealth are huge. So the inequalities that were created when the country was founded have never been remedied. And so certain groups have been able to accumulate wealth for centuries and others have not. So that still has consequences on how much money their families have. Also, lower home ownership rates and lower home values contribute to wealth gaps. So even when whites and blacks have the same incomes, their actual net worth is significantly different. And we're talking like $80,000 difference, so very significant. This is really has a significant impact on the social mobility prospects of African Americans. So for example, there's a sociologist named Patrick Sharkey at New York University who's shown that it takes the average African American family about 8 generations to get out of poverty, and part of this is very much attributed to limited economic resources. So we see a lot of people, he has a book out that's called Stuck in Place, because we see a lot of people that are essentially stuck in place. We also see that when African Americans reach middle class status, they are less likely to be able to stay there and less likely to be able to pass that status on to their children, so they have disproportionately high downward mobility rates. And a lot of this, again, is the consequence of persistent economic inequality, not having as many economic resources, so it's hard to maintain class position and to achieve upward mobility and maintain upward mobility. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about health. And all these things obviously are interconnected. The neighborhood that you live in, the job that you have, the amount of money that you have, all ties into your health outcomes and vice versa. But health is an increasingly important area that people are focusing on, particularly social scientists who didn't often talk about it as much for several decades. We're talking a lot more about health. And a lot of research on health disparities between African Americans and whites has emerged over the past few years. So we see that African Americans face persistent disparities in access to health care and health outcomes that, again, are being documented increasingly. So the NAACP has a great fact sheet on their website about health disparities between African Americans and whites. And so I'm going to share a few things with you, a few statistics. African Americans account for 13% of the US population and 49% of people who get HIV and AIDS. So this means that African Americans are, as of 2005, were 9 times more likely than whites to contract HIV or AIDS. African Americans are also 13% of the population, but 26% of the people in the US that die from heart disease. So this means that there's a disproportionately high likelihood that African Americans will die from heart disease. 46% of African Americans ages 20 and older suffer from cardiovascular disease. 14% of African Americans, almost 15% of African Americans 20 and older have diabetes. Blacks are 1.5 times more likely than whites to contract diabetes. 43% of African American women and 39% of African American men suffer from hypertension, so almost half. African Americans have the highest rate of obesity out of any group, and we are 51% more likely to be obese compared to whites. In addition, African Americans are less likely to have access to health care. While circumstances have certainly improved and are continuing to improve since the passage of the Affordable Care Act, a 2015 study by the Pew Research Center finds that African Americans in particular are less likely to continue to be the least likely to have health care, or less likely than other groups. And this is in part because African Americans are a lot more likely to live in states that are refusing to expand Medicaid coverage. So 55% of African Americans are living in states that won't expand Medicare coverage despite the Affordable Care Act. So that means that there are a lot of African Americans that have gaps in healthcare coverage. In addition, the Healthcare for America Now organization finds that African Americans are less likely to have a regular doctor. And there's been some research that's coming out that shows that a lot of this is probably shaped in part by African Americans' experiences with racism and discrimination and lack of trust in healthcare professionals. So there's a sociologist, Abigail Sewell at Emory University, who finds that African Americans and also Latinos are less likely than whites to trust physicians. And so when we think about all of these health disparities, that some that I've just listed and others that exist in lack of access to healthcare, it is not shocking, right, that African Americans don't trust healthcare professionals, so there's a cycle going on there of not trusting, not getting the appropriate healthcare for health problems, and so this obviously has a negative impact on quality of life, health expectancy, family interactions, and ability to work, ability to interact fully with other members of society. If you're not healthy, it's hard to do a lot of different things. So health is an important area that I think is getting more focus where we see significant disparities that have yet to be solved. So the final issue I'm going to discuss that has arguably captured the most national attention over the past couple of years is incarceration and persistent police brutality and killings of African Americans. So Michelle Alexander, who probably many people have heard of at this point, argues that incarceration has become America's new Jim Crow. And she argues this because she argues that incarceration has essentially replaced Jim Crow as a new way to maintain America's racial hierarchy. When Jim Crow was made illegal, white Americans, according to Michelle Alexander, needed a new way to preserve the racial hierarchy, to control African Americans and later Latinos in order to prevent them from accessing the full rights of American citizenship. So initially, Jim Crow made it legal to prevent them from accessing full rights of American citizenship. When that was determined not to be legal, something else was needed to replace it. And so we have seen the era of mass incarceration. And indeed, rates of incarceration have risen dramatically since Richard Nixon first declared that we needed a war on drugs. I'm not sure if anybody has been following the news over the past couple of days, but one of his former aides, John Ehrlichman, has recently come out and admitted that this war on drugs that Nixon invented was essentially a way to control African Americans and also anti-war protesters. So the consequences have been shocking. Oh, that was wealth. I should have shown that to you earlier, but we're going to skip it. If anybody wants to see that wealth chart later, we can come back to it. But now we're on to incarceration rates. So this is a look at incarceration rates between 1960 and 2010. And black men are the top group, then we see white men, then we see Latino men, and then the second group of graphs is women, black women, white women, and Latino women. So what obviously stands out to you is that dark green bar at the very top in the top group. And so that is the number of black men that are incarcerated, so per 100,000 men. So it's over 4,000 per 100,000, and this was in 2010. And that's in contrast to the light green, that was 1960. So incarceration rates have quadrupled, basically, for black men, and have increased across the board for white men, but clearly not anywhere near the level that they have for black men. And also we see drastic increases for Latinos. So the consequences, so one might think that perhaps, right, this is happening because certainly maybe people are just committing more crimes, they've become more, disgruntled since 1960 and want to engage in different types of criminal activity. But data from the National Research Council shows that since the 1970s, violent crime and property crime and other types of crime have actually declined significantly. At the same time, we've seen this sharp rise in mass incarceration, so it's certainly not explained by any rise in any type of crime. Data also show that most people are in prison for nonviolent crimes, such as drug crimes and property crimes, and this is really hurting African Americans in particular, who are more likely to be targeted, particularly for drug crimes. The Pew Research Council reports that as of 2010, black men were 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men, and also black women significantly more likely to be incarcerated. So our state has the distinction of being one of the worst states in the country when it comes to racial disparities in incarceration. The Prison Policy Initiative, which is where I got this graph, finds that as of 2010, about 3,400 per 100,000 African Americans in the state were incarcerated, compared to just 324 per 100,000 whites. So that means African Americans are 10 times more likely in Iowa to be incarcerated than whites. So I recently received a letter in the mail from 2 prisoners who are incarcerated in Des Moines, or in the Des Moines area, both for nonviolent offenses. One is serving a 15-year sentence for being a habitual offender. His last offense involved having less than a quarter gram of marijuana. In the letter he wrote me, he went out of his way to emphasize that he wanted to take responsibility for his actions and fully acknowledge that it was wrong in the eyes of the law to be in possession of marijuana. But as he emphasized, being in jail for 15 years seems hardly a response to an appropriate response to having a small amount of marijuana, particularly at a time when we see people becoming more likely to acknowledge benefits of marijuana, medical benefits. We see it becoming decriminalized in some parts of the country, and then we have this gentleman writing me a letter, and he's in jail for 15 years over marijuana-related offenses. So the consequences of incarceration for the men who wrote me and for the hundreds of thousands of others are severe. Back to Michelle Alexander's point about incarceration being the new Jim Crow, incarceration deprives people of color of the same rights in the same way that Jim Crow laws did. The men who wrote me and others will have trouble getting jobs, housing, educational opportunities. They also may lose their right to vote. And so our criminal justice system has basically taken away their right to full American citizenship. In addition to high incarceration rates, the Washington Post reports that nearly 1,000 people were killed by police in 2015. Other sources report larger numbers. To put this in context, this is almost equivalent to the number of lives lost in the tragic terrorist attacks in Brussels a couple of days ago every single week in the United States. So basically, the number of police killings is equivalent to a terrorist attack in the US every single week. The site Mapping Police Violence estimates that unarmed African Americans are 5 times more likely to be killed by police than whites. Mapping Police Violence has profiles on their website of many of victims of police violence and individuals who have died for unexplained reasons in police custody. So I'm going to read a few of their stories, and I recommend going to their website. It's mappingpoliceviolence.org to read more stories of people that have died in police custody, either directly as a result of a weapon or by some sort of indirect, unexplained cause. So for example, they profiled Tony Robinson, who was killed in March of 2015 in Madison, Wisconsin. According to their website, police claimed that Tony Robinson attacked an officer who was responding to calls that had been put in from friends and residents nearby who were claiming that he was behaving erratically or aggressively. So the police came on the scene and shot him almost immediately. His family has filed a federal civil rights lawsuit, but right now no officers have been charged with the crime for killing him, and again, he was unarmed. Matthew Ajibad was killed January 1st, 2015 in Savannah, Georgia. His girlfriend called 911 to ask for help. because he was having a manic episode. He was bipolar. And instead of arresting him, the police took him, instead of providing him with some sort of health care or taking him to a hospital, the police they arrested him and took him to a detention center. And what happened after that remains not completely clear. The officers claim he was violent, but he did not have a weapon. But they put him in a restraining chair, and he died in the restraining chair. And somebody was actually convicted of cruelty to an inmate in that case. George Mann, killed in July 2015 in Stonewall, Georgia. So police were called to his house after he was apparently irate and locked in his garage. So if you're locked in your garage alone, probably not much of a threat to anybody but yourself. But apparently the officers say they tried to negotiate with him, and he was not working with them, and so they tased him, and he died from the interaction at a hospital, and no one's been charged with that. Sandra Bland is a case that people are obviously probably much more familiar with, and it was in July 2015. She was pulled over on a routine traffic stop. She didn't signal when she changed lanes, and was arrested and found dead in her jail cell. And the only charge has been involving the arrest and the actions of the officer related to, it's a perjury charge, but it's not a charge for actually killing her, and there's no explanation for how she died. Right now in the jail cell, really the police are saying she killed herself, but there's not a convincing explanation of how she died. Christian Taylor, August 2015 in Arlington, Texas. Christian was 19, and he went to a car dealership after it was closed, and I guess was doing some teenage pranks, was seen jumping around in cars. It's unclear, but when the police were called and went to the scene, they shot him. He was unarmed. And nobody has been charged in that death. Finally, Betty Jones, killed on December 25th, 2015 in Chicago. She was shot accidentally while the police were supposedly helping a neighbor deal with a domestic violence situation with their son. So she was sort of caught in the crossfire, so to speak. She opened her door, I guess, to direct the officers to where to go to deal with the domestic violence dispute when they got to the apartment building, and then she was shot. And nobody's been charged for that. So this state-sponsored violence is just another painful indicator that we are far from achieving any type of racial equality. The fact that officers are rarely charged in any of these cases reveals the extent of our stalled progress in the post-civil rights era. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now, and then we'll have questions if you guys have questions. So as we reflect on the legacy of an important civil rights leader, Alexander Clark, I think it's important to think directly think critically not only about the progress that we've made, but the racial disparities that persist. I've discussed a few issues tonight that I see as important, but there are many others that I didn't have time to talk about here. But overall, we see that African Americans have yet to be fully included in American society. A 2014 poll by Gallup shows that while over half of whites think that race relations between blacks and whites will be worked out, less than half of blacks feel the same way. Similarly, a 2015 survey from the New York Times reveals that blacks are much less optimistic about American race relations than whites. This means that not only do we see persistent racial disparities, but the burden of these disparities weighs heavily on how African Americans perceive their future in this country. The rights and privileges that are promised to us as citizens have yet to be granted, and we are not sure when we will ever gain those rights and privileges. In order to move toward a more equal society, we must be optimistic, but we must also be honest about our weaknesses. We should avoid becoming content because we can turn on CNN in the evening and see a President Barack Obama dancing in Argentina, which was wonderful. But we should avoid becoming content in this moment. Instead, we should focus on putting in the real work that is needed to achieve true equality. This means difficult conversations, recognition of the persistence of white privilege, and a willingness to sacrifice comfort and contentment for the lives of others. If everyone in this room is willing to do this, then we can move closer to the type of society that Alexander Clark might have hoped for. And we'll stop there and take questions.